Welcome to Exceptionally Speaking, the podcast where we explore how to better understand and support exceptional learners. I'm Dr. Meryl, and each week I sit down with dedicated educators, parents, and advocates to share real strategies, inspiring stories, and moments of hope. If you're enjoying these conversations or learning something new, please be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Today, I'm joined by Emily Perks, a gifted education consultant, educational therapist, former gifted teacher, and the founder of Beyond Gifted Services. Emily partners with teachers, families, and adults navigating giftedness and twice exceptionality to find best fit environments, from the K-12 experience through careers and beyond. She's also the author of the CURIOUS Career Workbook, a first-of-its-kind guide to career clarity for gifted, creative, multi-talented, and differently wired minds who want more than just a one-size-fits-all path. Emily's journey has touched every part of the pipeline, from classroom teaching and research on creativity and intelligence to nearly a decade in workforce development, creating real-world pathways for high school and early college students, especially those from underserved backgrounds. With a strengths-based whole child lens and a focus on the transition from gifted kid to thriving gifted adult, she shares insights on choosing a right fit high school, prioritizing mental health supports, and asking the right questions on school tours. We also explore how career and technical education and concurrent enrollment can expand, not limit, college options, and how mentorship, self-advocacy, and the supportive communities she builds through groups facilitated through the Supporting Emotional Needs of the Gifted organization help gifted and twice exceptional students thrive beyond high school. You can find more information about all our guests at hex24press.com. Please enjoy Exceptionally Speaking with Emily Perks. Hey, Emily, it's so good to see you. Thank you for being on Exceptionally Speaking today.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm really excited for this conversation, of course, talking about our gifted and twice exceptional students, but really focusing on the secondary level support. I feel like that's an often overlooked topic. But before we dig into that topic, can we just start off with you sharing a little bit more about your educational journey and how'd you end up in gifted education and doing what you're doing today?
Yeah. It's kind of an odyssey. I am a grown-up gifted kid and definitely have had multiple careers the way a lot of gifted kids who grow up do. So I started with getting my bachelor's in psychology. I worked in several neuroscience labs, one with a researcher named Rex Young, who was looking at the neuroscience of creativity and intelligence. And I spent a couple of years in his lab, and we were really looking at the way that intelligence unfolds in both gifted adolescence and then also into adulthood, and what causes some folks to reach eminence while others take kind of different paths. And so that was kind of the start of it for me. And I left there to go get my master's degree because I decided I wanted to teach and work with gifted kids directly. So got my master's in gifted education, then taught for a little bit, and then realized I really liked being in academia. So went back to academia and spent almost a decade there doing workforce development. And that was really thinking about the transition for folks from like K-12 into college and beyond. And I ended up working with a lot of gifted kids who were now college age, who maybe weren't labeled in that way, but definitely were gifted kids. They were kind of an underserved group. I developed one of the first programs here in the state of Colorado for undergrads from underserved backgrounds who are interested in mental health careers. And like I said,
Cool.
did that for about a decade. So I've had touch points with sort of gifted families and gifted kids my entire career. It's just been in lots of different fashions. And then most recently went out on my own. I have my own company, Beyond Gifted Services, where I work partly as an educational therapist, doing support for things like executive function needs, dyslexia support, those sorts of things for 2E kids. But then I also do education consulting with families, so helping them find the right schools, helping them understand the gifted education landscape because it varies a lot. State by state, but even sort of district by district here in Colorado in terms of like what testing looks like and all those sorts of things. And then I also do kind of the adult side of things. So thinking about that transition period, I realized there were a lot of adults who needed support too in the gifted space. So I do career coaching with gifted adults, work a lot with those parents of the kids that come to me. So kind of full lifespan support for gifted and 2E needs.
That's wonderful. I'm so glad you're doing the work. I think it's so needed. So happy to have this conversation with you today. I'd love to start talking about high school support and then kind of switching over into post-secondary, what kind of support gifted students need. So thinking about families who have students who are eighth graders, right? They're looking at which high school should we go to? What should I be considering? It's such a big decision. It's so daunting. For better or worse, there are a lot of options in the Denver metro area for
Yes.
high schools.
Yes.
But even outside of that, maybe you're limited on options and you only have two. So how do you decide? So I'm wondering from your point of view, what are some questions or things that families should be considering when thinking about what high school might fit their gifted kids' needs best?
Yeah, by the time you get to secondary, to like the high school and post-secondary sort of space, you see kids' interests are a lot more developed by that point, typically. Not always. Sometimes kids are still really exploring, and that's great too. Actually, we don't want to limit that. Studies have shown that giving kids the opportunity to try a lot of different things actually creates more well-rounded people, but also people who are better in whatever domain they actually end up in because they've had a variety of experiences that they can pull into whatever that field is they finally decide to go into. So I always say it's not so much about specialization at this point, unless you've got a kid who, is the performing arts kid or is a kid who is playing club sports, and you've got to think about how school fits into club sports or whatever those sorts of things are. And I always say too to families, like, instead of picking the best school, we want to pick the right school, because even the best school on paper, quote unquote, top test scores, well known in the community as being sort of the revered school, those sort of things, that's not always the best fit for your really sensitive, gifted kids, particularly if they are really differently wired, kind of quirky, maybe don't have those mainstream interests. Sending those kids to those really high pressure, high academic schools isn't always the best choice. So we're thinking about, first and foremost, who's the kid in front of us and, what things seem like burgeoning interests for that kid, looking kind of at the history of like, what has this child been interested in over time? Where are this child's strengths? Where are aptitudes that they want to develop? And thinking about how school fits within kind of the larger plan. That's kind of the work that I do, is making that connection so that K-12 doesn't just happen on its own. It's really something that's preparing us for the adult world, whatever that's going to look like for that student. So thinking about, how does high school fit into that larger picture of where that child wants to go kind of in their adult life?
Yeah, I think that's really good advice, and thinking more student-centered approach, right? Not just let me find the best high school. You can find the best high school in your state, in your city easily, but how does that work with your students' interests and their needs as well? So
Exactly.
maybe more broadly for parents of gifted students, what do you think is good for them to be looking for when they're on a tour? What should they be listening for just general gifted education supports?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I always kind of like harp on is socio-emotional supports, because that tends to be the thing that is lacking. Lots of schools have good academics. There's lots of ways to approach, whether it's AP classes or honors classes or an IB school, or there's lots of ways to get sort of rigorous course material. I am much more concerned about how we're meeting the mental health needs of our students, whether or not there are specific supports around sort of the gifted behaviors that we know are really inherent to gifted kids. So that strong sense of justice. Are there opportunities for kids to engage in social justice or in environmental justice, or the sorts of things that feel meaningful to them? What are we looking at in terms of things like perfectionism? So what does grading look like? Are there opportunities for students to continue to learn, or is it really like sink or swim sort of environment? And I'm always thinking about, like, how do we make it an environment where gifted kids are going to thrive? Because being gifted doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be the top of your class. It's a different way of thinking. And so, how do we find the right school that's going to holistically support who a gifted person is in kind of all of their domains, which may also mean support for twice exceptionality too. So that's another thing that I think about, is like, if you've got a child with dyslexia or dysgraphia, what sort of accommodations can the school put into place? Because again, forcing your kid to go into a school that maybe is a quote unquote good school, but they don't have any of those sorts of supports, is going to be a recipe for everybody to be upset. And what you want is to find a school where your child's strengths are going to be really able to shine through.
I think that's really great advice. We know the sad saying of like the gifted kids will be okay, right? And that gets worse the older the kids get. And we see that in high school too, where it's like, we have honors, we have AP, that's what we do for gifted kids. And so if that's the end of the sentence from a school, that's not what you're going to be looking for. There needs to be something else going on that's supporting students. And like you said, many gifted kids don't want to be in honors or AP, or that's not best for them to begin with. And so that can't be the end of the road for our gifted and twice exceptional students.
Absolutely. And I think we need to be thinking across domains. Again, I bring up like a performing arts school as an example, or even a trade school or concurrent enrollment. there's lots of ways to meet gifted learners' needs. So maybe it's that they're, one period a day they're going to the college nearby and taking a college course in something that's interesting to them. Or maybe they do work-based learning where in the afternoon they go and they're at a trade school in the afternoon learning a trade while in the morning they're doing their academic classes at their local high school. There's lots of ways to meet the needs of that child. And I think that's where parents get kind of lost is they're like, there's so many options. How do we narrow this down? And it's part of the reason that I do the work that I do with families. I also wrote a book, the Curious Career Workbook, which is it's a universally designed workbook. So lots of access points, whether your child has learning differences, they're gifted, they're creative, a multi-potentialite, that families can work through with their high schoolers too, to say, what are the things that are interesting to you? Where are we going kind of with all of this? How do we narrow some of all of that down, particularly when you've got a kid who's got a million different interests? So that's another option that I use with families sometimes is like, let's do some structured, like internal work, I guess, to kind of look at, what's driving a student and then try to match opportunities to what's going on internally for that student rather than trying to force them in a direction that like parents think might be best, for example.
Right. I love that. And I love that you wrote a book to help support that, to really give a tool for families and students to purposefully think through this. And it's not about having all the answers, right? It's about doing the thinking and working through it as a family.
Yeah. And that's one of the the framework that I follow, the reason it's called the Curious Career Workbook is that CURIOUS is an acronym, and
Okay.
one of the letters is iterate. And that's one thing that I really push. Again, this is coming from my background in workforce development, is thinking about how we use that sort of iterative process to try out a lot of different things. So thinking about, a student says they're interested in botany. Okay, can we set up an internship for them to go work at like CSU Spur here in town, or one of the other, CSU's got like an amazing horticultural program. Could we have them go test some things out there, try it out? And then we get real-time feedback. So maybe they do a semester there and we say, how was that? Was that interesting? Is this more of where you want to specialize? Should we pull back? Should we look at something else? And we're just treating it as like low stakes, interest-based engagement rather than like trying to force a kid down a certain path. Because again, there's just really good data that says having lots of exploration is a really productive thing for kids. And it gives them a sense of ownership over sort of their entry into the adult world while they're still in K-12. It gives them that exposure. It gives them things that can go right on their resume. There's lots of really good things about that. So I always sort of push that about like, how can we create low stakes experiments that are interesting to that student that are going to help eventually kind of cultivate those adult interests so that when they arrive at adulthood, they're not so lost or like forced to look at a sea of 1,000 options and they've never touched any of it. And yet we've got a really expensive college degree that we've got to go through here, and we're not going to pay for extra years for you to try out a million things. It's much easier for us to do that kind of in the safety of the parents' home in K-12 than it is to like get into college or even get your college degree and find out you hated the thing you went for college for and have to like go get a second degree, those sorts of things. So experimenting often and early is my big push.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice. And has me thinking too about parents who are making high school decisions with their child to find out, because a lot of high schools have different tracks, right? And different, hey, if you choose this CTE career track or whatever it may be, asking, hey, when can you make a different decision? Am I locked in from 9th grade forward, or is there a chance in 10th grade to change my mind? Like, what does that look like? Because yes, of course, outside of school, we want to give opportunities as well. But if you feel like you're forced into one area at school and then a year later you're like, maybe this isn't my interest anymore, that's okay. First of all, that's good learning about yourself. That's a good thing to know. And how does the school support that? Is a good thing to consider. So I'd love to hear more about CTE, Career and Technical Education, for our parents or listeners who are maybe unfamiliar. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and maybe any success stories that you've seen for our gifted or 2E students who've been involved in CTE in high school and beyond?
Yeah. So this is where, like I say, I have the bulk of my experience. So I worked at the University of Colorado for almost a decade, and the workforce development program that I created was really with high schoolers and like early college students in mind, thinking about how we can get that exposure to the like real world aspects of the jobs they're interested in while also gaining college credit or high school credit, that sort of things. It started out, the program that I developed, the acronym was PURPLE. Boy, I love my acronyms. It was the Psychology Undergraduate Research Program and Learning Experience, so PURPLE. And that program was really intended, again, for students who came from communities maybe that had higher rates of poverty, kids who maybe wouldn't have the same level of access to school, kids who were first-generation college students, immigrants, all those sorts of things, thinking about how do we give opportunities to those students who traditionally are overlooked by the system. Maybe they weren't formally identified because our gifted identification, it's a whole nother conversation, but maybe because gifted identification wasn't equitable. And how do we, at kind of the high school to early college point, do some sort of intervention that ends up being successful for those students long term? So the focus of the program, we started out as just a summer program, but that evolved over the course of the year. And we started out just with undergraduates, and that also evolved to including high schoolers in the Aurora Public Schools. Got a grant, Perkins Technical Education grant to do that, to expand the program out into high schools. And kind of the way that worked was it's a form of learning exchange where students during the summer would come onto campus, they'd get paired with a faculty mentor, and they'd actually learn the tools of the trade. So we'd go through things, because this was behavioral health, talking about statistics and research methods and what it was like to do clinical work with patients and kind of what does that look like to be, an actual practitioner in the field. And we tried to show students lots of different avenues for exposure to say, maybe you don't really like doing clinical work, but you really like doing research. This could be another avenue. Or maybe you don't like research, math is not your strong suit. So let's think about, what's the other side of this that you can do? Maybe you want to be in administration. That's also a really good job, is university administration. So we tried to show students lots of different avenues. And then out of that program, we ended up hiring almost half of those students over time into our actual department, which was incredible because it increased diversity within our department, which is always something we're looking for, which gives us lots of new perspectives. It broadens the sorts of research that we're doing. It was really beneficial from that perspective, but it also was a great avenue for students, again, to they get on-the-job training through that summer program, and then they become an employee of our department and can do that part-time while they're in college or high school or those sorts of things, which is just such a fabulous way to be introduced to the world of work as adults while you're still, finishing up your schooling and those sorts of things. So that program, like I said, it's still running, which is fantastic. I think the proudest thing that I have to say about that is that one of my former students in the program is the one who's running it now. And she actually is managing another student that as the assistant program director for that, who came in a subsequent year. So, it's really been a full circle thing to be able to see that. But that, that's just one example of how that can be done. Again, we expanded that out to high schools. So the opportunity was for high schoolers then to come on campus throughout the year as part of elective courses. They could come and do shadowing. We did some week-long intensives where they could come on campus and we'd do different sort of behavioral health work each of those 5 days that they would come on. So there's lots of ways that CTE can look like part of this traditional curriculum. It can look like a summer internship. There's lots of ways to kind of make it work. And I think that's the exciting thing, is that it can be accessible no matter whether or not you're in a rural area, whether you're somebody who has time after school, whether you have transportation or not. There's lots of ways to kind of make it work, even virtual settings, mentorship, all those sorts of things.
That's great. That's great. One of the things I think is a misconception about CTE is families thinking either my child is college bound or they have to do CTE. And I know that's not true, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit more and dispel that myth.
Yeah. I mean, programs like the one I led honestly, these were kids who probably were going to go to college and also needed on-the-job training. And I think that's it exactly, that it doesn't have to be either or. And, in sort of the gifted world, we talk about polymaths or multi-potentialites, people who've got lots of different interests. And this is a particularly beneficial arrangement for those kids because they can try out a variety of different things and decide whether they want to do something that maybe is more hands-on or whether they want to move into an information-heavy job where they're on a computer, those sorts of things. Again, it's a great time to try it out is while they're still in school, and it doesn't have to be an either or. I often, part of the work that I do with families is how do we patch together the appropriate amount of enrichment? What does the school day look like? Where does work fit in? How do we kind of make that holistic view for kids so that it doesn't have to be either or, that, you could do 2 hours of volunteering on the weekend in a certain domain to get some exposure there. You can do a course throughout one semester where you're in another maybe CTE focused role. And then you can also be working towards college prereqs as part of that too. So it definitely is not an either or sort of thing. And that is so much of the work that I do with families is keeping that expansive mind. We talk about identity foreclosure, which is the idea that you narrow down on one specific thing and that becomes kind of your identity and your focus. And that does a real disservice to gifted kids. We see that when they reach gifted adulthood, is that identity foreclosure really gets in the way. An example of that would be like a kid who thinks they're destined for med school. And so all they've done is like medical school prereqs. Then they get into the degree program and they really don't enjoy it. They don't like it at all. But that's kind of all they've done the whole way throughout school. And now they feel all this pressure to be a doctor, even though, maybe they want to be a dentist. Maybe they want to be something else entirely. So a lot of that work is just helping families and teens to keep their eyes and minds open for what's out there for them, because the world of work a decade from now isn't even going to look like what it does today.
Yeah. And how few of us actually are doing the thing that we thought we were going to be doing when we started college, right?
Totally. If the job that I have now is a perfect example. My job doesn't really exist. I mean, it's not really like nobody's going to see the work that I do in like the Bureau of Labor Statistics occupational handbook, right? Like there's no list of like educational consultant / educational therapist / all the different things that I do. I write, I speak, all these sorts of things. And had I limited myself to sort of one specific domain, I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do this. And I think, the kids who are going to be most successful in the future are going to be those kids who have what I call portfolio careers, where they've got lots of different areas, they have different skills. And at any given time, when the market evolves, they can pivot towards a specific part of that portfolio or another, rather than being kind of pigeonholed into one thing.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And I haven't heard that term before, identity foreclosure. I know what you're talking about, but I've never heard it named that. So that is so interesting. Thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering too, what other patterns or challenges have you seen for gifted and twice exceptional students as they navigate high school and then choosing a post-secondary option?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. I'm currently working as a steering group member for a group through the Mensa Foundation. I'm working with a couple of the people who released this big report that they did last year. It's the Mensa's study of unmet needs of gifted adults. And this was a really interesting study. Both of the crosses were part of that. And that was really, looking at when you get to gifted adulthood, where are the areas that we are missing specific domains of support, and where could we have addressed things in K-12 before we get to that point in adulthood? And one of the really prominent findings in there was that career was a major area where we are missing supporting gifted children transitioning into gifted adulthood. So some of the main areas we saw there, gifted kids really need mentorship. They need structured mentorship from other adults who understand their giftedness. So not just, people who are eminent in the field and want to push them a certain direction, but gifted adults who understand things like being a polymath or multipotentiality or their deep sensitivity or, kind of all of those things. So that's a really important one. They often need help figuring out how to kind of put it all together into a package when they've got so many different interests. So that's a piece that they really need support with. Certainly the socio-emotional aspects. So like, how do you get over your perfectionism so that you can get out and do some of the things that I'm describing? I think we learners in particular also really have a lot of challenges because often in K-12, we've focused so much on their quote unquote deficits and we're not thinking about their strengths. And we need people who can look from a strengths-based lens at people who are 2E to think about, how does that actually apply in the world of work? A lot of times, we either give these pat responses of like, you can do anything, or it's like, you can never do that because you have dyslexia. And both of those things are really damaging. And so what we want to do instead is think about like, what's a realistic pathway? Like if you're really interested in something that is a writing heavy career, but you have dyslexia, like what are the supports that you're going to need? What are the accommodations you're going to need? And the IEP process can be really helpful and important for that too. We want to be really using that process as a way to prepare students, again, for adulthood, stepping down support over time as they get closer to the end of high school so that they're really ready to go out into the adult world, and teaching 2E learners in particular how to advocate for themselves in work environments, knowing the laws around accommodations, all those sorts of things can help it be a more successful transition for them into adulthood if they kind of know what they're going to need to ask for, what works best for them. Again, treating K-12 as this experiment ground where they can try things out to figure out what's going to work best so that adulthood doesn't feel like such an abrupt, like, you're out on your own. They will have had a lot of practice along the way.
Yes, absolutely. I know there's such a heavy focus on achievement and test scores, especially for our gifted youth. And then it turns into this phrase that I came up with, equity does not end at proficiency, right? Like we can't just stop caring about our kids as soon as they're proficient. Like, well, we're moving on to the other cusp kids. Like that is not the case at all. And it's so frustrating because we have kids coming in who are well beyond proficient on day one and then don't get any special care or attention on their life plan, which is what we're talking about. Yeah,
exactly. And that's something consistently that they found in that Mensa study foundation was just so many kids said they got absolutely no support because the support was going to other kids in the classroom who were perceived to have higher needs than them. But they had just the same sorts of concerns, questions, fears moving into college and adulthood that their classmates did. They just were presumed to have a level of competence that the other students didn't. And I think we have to remember, with all students, you want to presume competence, but not assume it, right? So we want to make sure we give students the benefit of the doubt, but also that means we also need to say, hey, would you like some support around this or this or this? Or, hey, let's explore this together. Again, thinking about adults really, especially in the high school setting, are in such a powerful position to be able to help students have that successful transition to adulthood. So that, again, that it's not this abrupt, scary thing. It's like they've got some strategies and some ideas, but we have to be thinking about high school as a fertile ground for that, not just, like you said, the place to take honors classes or the place to take AP classes. Like, there's a certain level of life skills training that needs to happen, even for gifted students, which I think people sort of think like they're going to figure it out on their own, which is, we all know is that scary phrase, but they really do need that support still.
Yes, I think people sometimes forget that gifted people and students, they still have to learn the thing. Yes, it may only take one repetition for them to learn it, but they don't just automatically know how to figure out their life, what career they might want to take. We still have to give them the skills to do that.
Yes, yes. And I think, again, taking some of the pressure off the academic lens, I always, when I was teaching, I would say to parents, like, your kid is in a home where you are here at parent night. You are here actively engaged in your child's learning. They're going to be fine academically as long as we do lots of support around all the other pieces. Then their brain is going to be ready to learn. If we're providing the social emotional supports that they need, we're giving them mental health supports, all those sorts of things. But sometimes what we do, I think, as a society is we really focus hard on the academic piece and the other stuff sort of falls by the wayside. And I always think, does it matter if your child is brilliant at physics if when they get to adulthood, they can't even get to class on time because they were never
Right.
really taught how, those sort of executive function skills or sort of those other structures. And so I want us to think so broadly about what it means to educate a child, not just gifted kids, but like every child. We really need to be thinking holistically about what that means getting to adulthood. So we don't have, employers who say, well, students don't know how to show up on time, or they don't understand how to send an email, or they don't understand some of these things. Like, K-12 is the place we can be helping to support some of those things.
And I wonder too how we can really encourage families to advocate for post-secondary exploration through advanced learning plans. I do feel
Yeah.
like, not all states have them, but we're lucky in Colorado that we do. And whatever version your state may have on supporting gifted students, I know, and I've heard from many students themselves that they feel like the ALP is kind of worthless once you get to high school.
Yes.
But that's on us as the adults managing the programs to figure out why is it worthless, what could be more meaningful, and to help give families and students the right language to advocate for, hey, I have an ALP, great. I need support figuring out what I want to do after high school or what I want to do in high school at all. So I wonder how we can
Yeah.
help encourage families to do that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think a piece of it too is like thinking in terms of economies of scale. It can be really hard for parents to be like up against a very large system and asking for a special, quote unquote, accommodation for their kid, even though that's their legal right. It is much easier if you get a group of 5 or 6 parents whose students all want to go take classes at the local community college, and then you can arrange for transportation for 6 kids to the college each afternoon. So I always say to families, getting in touch with your local gifted and talented organization, talking to folks in the district who, the gifted coordinators at your school, if you've got them, kind of whoever you've got that you can reach out to in your area, that can be a really important advocacy strategy so that it's not just you coming up against a system. Another thing that I always tell families is like, see what has happened in other districts. So what have they been able to make possible in other districts, other schools, those sorts of things, and try to follow those models because typically those are the easier things for districts to accommodate. If they've been able to do it previously, you can say, hey, they're doing this over here and this is how they're making it work. Like creating a very easy pathway for administrators to be able to say, yes, we can make that work. We see how they made that work. The job of parents in that case is to help be facilitators to that. And to partner with schools to say, like, oh, this is benefiting schools, this is benefiting students. This is a win-win for everybody. So how do we come together to create these opportunities? I've seen that work a lot more successfully than individual parents trying to like force something through for their kid.
I think that's a really, really great point to also to help parents understand you're not alone in what you're seeking for your child. But especially from my point of view, working as a department leader in a district, if we have a group of parents showing up asking for something, that is received way differently than just one email that keeps coming through every couple months. And there's a power in numbers. And I also believe that true change in public education comes from families understanding what their students are not getting and what they should be getting, and
Yeah.
then helping them advocate for it. I don't really see the landscape of education changing without families being heavily involved.
Absolutely. I mean, I think for better or worse during the pandemic, parents saw a lot more what was happening in their schools. Was it an accurate reflection of like what the day-to-day looks like? Absolutely not, right? That was like emergency. But I do think more parents finally got some insight into what happens in the school day. And I'll say, before I got my master's degree in education, I don't think I even fully understood like what was going on within the school system. It really took me being actually both in an independent school and in a magnet school in a public school system to see like a broader perspective of what's actually occurring here, because it's so different. Even within a single district, the way something is implemented at the school level can look really different depending on the makeup of the school, the administration, the kids that are there. And so having a sense of that was really helpful for me in thinking about where I send my kids to school. And so I encourage parents to, attend school board meetings, understand what's going on, go to parents' night, talk to your kid about what's happening during the day. Again, not from this perspective of like being skeptical, but just understanding like what is it your child's day-to-day like, so that you can start to kind of pinpoint like, oh, this is maybe a gap for my kid or something that we can supplement with. And again, it's not always going to be the school's responsibility to do that. If you have a kid, who's like destined to be a virtuoso of like classical music, it's probably on the parents in a lot of respects to help figure out what those opportunities are. But you can also think about, how do we work with the school to make sure we can make those opportunities available to our kids too. So that level of involvement is just so important. And I also recognize that's a privilege, that not all families have the time, money, resources, availability to do that. And so from the school's part, as much as teachers can be sort of talent scouts, I think that can be a really helpful thing too, is helping parents to see like, hey, so-and-so comes to school each day and they're so good at blah, 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 right? Whatever the thing is. And helping parents to make that connection to home too, like even using conferences to say, hey, I'm seeing your kid is doing great at this, this, and this. And again, coming from that strengths-based lens, we're always thinking about addressing deficits. It's important, but also we should be thinking about what is that kid really good at? Because in adulthood, being well-rounded is kind of overrated. Like we often end up just going with whatever the thing is that our strength is. That's where people tend to have the most success. And so I think we have to be thinking about that for kids too, of like, of course, how do we support the things that are challenges, but also how do we get them into spaces where they're going to be successful too? And that takes cooperation between parents and schools.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really wonderful role for GT specialist teachers, for the schools that have them, to really be that conduit between the teacher and the family, to ask those questions of teachers. What are you noticing about your students? Who's really shining in some specific areas? And then helping to connect that to mentorships or career exploration or whatever it may be, to help that family get supported through that. So
yeah, and there was a great research study about that showed that really what brought kind of the most support for 2E kids was when they had adults in their lives who focused first on their strengths and second on their challenges. So I think that's something I always try to keep in mind, is like, what is the wonderful thing about this child in front of you? What's the best thing that they do? What's the thing that brings them meaning every day? Let's lean heavily into that first and foremost, because those kids who develop a sense of self-efficacy, that they understand their strengths, they're a lot less defensive when we move to the point of needing to support areas of deficit too. If you can say, hey, you are excellent at writing, this is an area that's a little tougher for you, but like, let's continue to let you be in those classes where you are excellent at writing. Let's not take that away to just go focus on putting you in math classes or something where you've got to like make things up. Let's think about how we do writing first, and then we do those secondary sort of addressing the challenges. Again, it's that strength-based lens. If parents can come from a strength-based lens, if schools can, we see much better outcomes for 2E kids.
I think that's a great point. Well, before we wrap up and have our final question, is there anything else that we've missed or that you'd like to share in this conversation?
I'll just hammer it home again that, gifted kids become gifted adults. And I think that's something that we know it intuitively, and yet really the supports drop off. Frankly, after elementary school, they become lower, and they become lower each year until kids reach adulthood. And there's very little support for gifted adulthood. So I think just keeping that long range sort of picture in mind, and with the understanding that, not every kid is going to go work in a traditional job. It doesn't mean we're preparing our children to participate in capitalism. It doesn't, it's thinking about how do we help kids develop the things that are interesting to them, that are going to create meaningful lives for them. And again, focusing on their strengths and just thinking about parents as being that conduit to help create that support for students so that we don't have kids who arrive to adulthood feeling so lost, that there's so many opportunities to intervene and support along the way. And that's our job as parents, as educators, as gifted coordinators. I think if we can all sort of take that frame of mind, we'll have a lot more really bright kids who grow up to be adults who are also feeling much more fulfilled and safe and happy in adulthood.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you for that. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I'd love to just hear what's giving you hope right now when you're thinking about schools and families and workplaces and how they're evolving to better support our gifted individuals and really finding purpose and belonging beyond school, beyond academics.
Yeah, something really neat that I've been doing this past year. I got certified to facilitate groups through supporting emotional needs of the gifted. And so I, on a weekly basis, hold virtual groups. They have different themes. So we've got a parent group, a virtual parenting group for parents and caregivers of gifted children. We've got gifted adult groups. We've got a neuro complexity group, which is really about we and kind of understanding the 2E experience. And those groups are giving me so much hope. Just hearing how excited people are in those groups, how engaged parents are, how much meaning adults are finding amongst one another. In the adult groups in particular, it's so cool to see adults who are like, I went through my whole life thinking I was really broken and then realized these were actually just parts of being gifted. And now I see there are other people who are just like me and I don't feel weird anymore. And I don't feel bad that I didn't manifest my potential the way I was expected to, or, those sorts of things. And I would just say those groups, how caring parents are in those groups. We really have a contingent of people who are interested in supporting gifted and 2E learners. And that makes me really excited that I think, as long as there are these grassroots sort of groups that are interested in supporting and doing this work, we will continue to see, lots of care and support for gifted learners. So that is the thing that makes my day each week. And I'm excited to keep hosting those into the new year too.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, so for anyone who's listening, who's interested, I will put Emily's contact information here in the show notes on YouTube, as well as on my website at hex24press.com. So you can get connected to her and all the wonderful work she's doing. So thank you so much, Emily. I've really enjoyed our conversation and I hope to have you back on in the future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meryl. It's great to be here.
This episode of Exceptionally Speaking is brought to you by Hex24 Press, where education meets imagination. I founded Hex24 Press in 2024 to uplift educator voices and provide a publishing home for myself and other educators to bring our work into the world. You can find more information about today's guests, including links to their resources and services, at hex24press.com. Thank you for supporting educators, independent creators, and small business. We're so glad you're here.